Chapter 17. Skylar had barely managed to get Zane loaded up into the bed of her truck before her crew started rolling up to the house in their trucks. She'd covered him up with an old painting tarp. When one of her crew started ambling toward the truck, she'd made up some excuse about having to go check on another property and had driven away in a rush. She glanced in her rearview mirror to make sure the tarp was staying tied down. When she saw it held, she breathed out a sigh of relief. She turned off the small country road and onto the main highway. Sweat beaded at her temple and rolled down her cheek as the summer heat bore down on the metal truck. She so needed to get the air fixed. It was going to be one of the first things she did if she ever started making a decent profit from her business. She leaned her head out the window to catch a breeze and caught her reflection in the mirror. Her red hair had started to frizz around her face, and her cheeks were flushed from the heat. She hadn't bothered with makeup today, and it showed. She didn't normally wear makeup to a job site. If she had anticipated meeting a hot-looking werewolf, then she would have at least slapped on some lip gloss. She sucked in a deep breath and shook her head. I have no idea why I'm even worried about it. It's not like he sees me as anything other than his little sister's friend. She'd always had a crush on Zane when she was little, but as soon as he'd left home to go to college, she'd not seen him anymore. He'd never see her as a woman, just a kid. Not to mention their social statuses were worlds apart. He was a gray wolf and she was a red. When she was little, she didn't realize that not all wolves were like her father. It was after meeting Zane's family that she saw that wolves could be loving and protective. It had given her hope that her father could change and be more loving. But that never happened. Things between the gray wolves and the red wolves turned ugly. The males of the red wolf pack had wanted to start taking over the gray wolf territory. When they met to conspire, it had turned deadly as the red wolves began fighting among themselves for more power and more control. By the time she'd graduated, the majority of the red wolves were dead. Not wanting to be the next casualty, she'd moved to Louisiana and gone to college. The last she'd heard, there were very few if any red wolves left in Arkansas, so running into Herschel had certainly been a shocker. She turned onto the street that led to her apartment. She slowed the truck and glanced in her rearview mirror. If she was hot, she knew Zane had to be cooking under that tarp. She turned into the parking lot of the Castlewoods apartments. She'd gotten into the apartments when they were first built 2 years ago. Right now wasn't a good time for her to be a homeowner, since she was so busy with her contracting work and didn't have time to take care of her own home. She pulled into the parking lot and grimaced. Her apartment was on the bottom floor, but there were a lot of cars in the parking lot and she couldn't risk letting Zane out here. She backed out of the parking spot and drove to the end of the lot. The back of the apartments faced a thick, lush tree line that continued on for a while. There was barely 5 feet between the buildings and the tree line. The only people she'd seen out there were dog walkers who didn't want to clean up after their dogs. If she could get her truck to the back of the apartments and let Zane out there would be less chance someone would spot him. Pressing her lips together, she cast a quick glacé around. She listened carefully. When she was sure she didn't see anyone, she eased her truck around the back of the apartments. Tree branches scraped across the passenger side of her truck, and she clenched her teeth, wondering how much damage it was doing to her paint job. Shoving her worries aside, she stopped her truck at the back of her apartment. She opened the door. It nudged the side of the building. She squeezed herself through the small opening and stopped at the back of the truck's bed. Stay here until I unlock my door. She kept her voice low as her gaze flitted around the wooded area. The last thing she needed was to catch her neighbor's attention by revealing a big-ass wolf in the back of her truck. She quickened her steps to her door and stuck her key in the doorknob. Skylar, hello dear. Mrs. Nelson cracked her door open and gave her a toothy grin. Skylar froze as her heart pounded in her throat. Mrs. Nelson was her nosy neighbor who didn't mind getting the other tenants in trouble whenever she thought they were up to no good. She'd called the cops twice last week on the poor girl who lived a few doors down for being a prostitute. Mrs. Nelson claimed the girl had a different guy every week. Turned out the girl was a college student who'd taken a part-time job tutoring students in English. Last month, Mrs. Nelson had called the cops on old man Grissom, who lived in the next building. She told the cops he was growing drugs in his apartment. Turned out he was growing something, but it was only mushrooms in his closet. Not the kind you get high on either. After that, Skylar tried to steer clear of Mrs. Nelson. She didn't need the old woman nosing around in her business or her personal life. Hello, Mrs. Nelson. She cut her eyes at the bed of her truck sticking out in plain sight. If Zane moved so much as an inch, the old woman would know. Something was up. Nothing got past her. I had to stop by and get some more tools for the construction site I'm working on. She gave the woman a forced smile and hoped it was enough. I didn't know you kept tools in your apartment. The old woman narrowed her beady eyes. Is that even legal? Shit. Oh, I told the landlord about it and he said it was perfectly fine. She dug her phone out of her back pocket and pulled up a number. Would you like to check with him? She spoke calmly and evenly, hoping she sounded more confident than she felt. Mrs. Nelson relaxed. The lines around her eyes drooped and her shoulders slumped. It was obvious she was disappointed she hadn't caught another criminal act. How's Luther doing, Mrs. Nelson? I've not seen him around lately. Skylar smiled brightly. Luther was Mrs. Nelson's grandson whom she used to brag about constantly. A day didn't go by that the old woman wasn't telling anyone who would listen about another of Luther's accomplishments. 4.0 in college, majoring in medicine and volunteering at the food bank. That was Luther in a nutshell. He was on his way to being the brightest and the best. Until he'd been arrested for a hit and run and charged with DUI. He'd gotten drunk at the country club, gotten thrown out, and had run over a homeless man who had been crossing the street. After further investigation, it turned out that Luther didn't have a 4.0. He'd failed out of college and had continued to lie to his parents about it. He'd taken the money they'd given him for college and used it on weed, booze, and women. It had also been rumored that Golden Boy Luther now had gonorrhea and gotten some girl knocked up. After that, Mrs. Nelson no longer brought up Luther to anyone. Mrs. Nelson's wrinkled face paled. Her eyes widened slightly, and if the woman had been wearing pearls, Skylar knew she would be clutching them in her sweaty palm. I've got to go. I have to check on something in the oven. Mrs. Nelson gave her a tight, polite smile that read F you and slammed the door. Skylar waited a few seconds, listening as the woman's footsteps clomped away and a tingle of regret slid around in her stomach. She knew bringing up the woman's grandson was a low blow, but it was the only way to get rid of Mrs. Nelson. Skylar raced to the back of the truck and pulled up the end of the tarpaulin. She was met with a brief growl in Zane's piercing wolf eyes. We've got to hurry, she whispered as she stepped back, allowing him space to jump down from the hot truck bed. His long tongue hung out the side of his mouth as he panted. She bet he felt like he was roasting in the ridiculous Arkansas heat. She hurried to her apartment and quickly opened the door. He wasted no time and raced inside. She stepped in behind him. The cool air hit her in the face as she locked the door and slid the deadbolt. She couldn't tear her gaze away from him as he padded into the living room. He changed course and headed away from the carpeted room and into the tiled kitchen. He paced back and forth and cut his eyes up at her as if trying to communicate. Oh, sorry. She hurried into the kitchen and pulled out her largest mixing bowl. Holding it under the faucet, she filled the bowl with cold water and then sat it on the floor. He dipped his head and lapped up the water in gulps. She opened the freezer and pulled out some ice cubes and dumped them into the bowl. You must have felt like you were baking under that canvas. She wiped away an errant drop of sweat from her brow. He glanced up at her as if agreeing before dipping his head again to lap up the cool water. A slight rumbling growl came from deep within his massive chest. She'd seen lots of werewolves, of course, but Zane was more beautiful than she'd ever imagined a male wolf could be. His lush gray fur had specks of silver, and her hand itched to run her fingers through the thick, silky hair. He cut his ice blue eyes up at her in an assessing kind of way. She looked away, embarrassed that he'd caught her staring at him so openly. He probably thought she was some desperate female. Who could blame her? Men like Zane were few and far between. I've got to get back to work. Stay here as long as you need. There's some food in the refrigerator if you get hungry after you shift back. She sat the pile of his clothes that she'd gathered up after he shifted on the kitchen counter. They were ruined. He busted out of them like a cat out of a bag, but it was all she had at the moment. I'll get some more clothes on my way home after work. He lifted his head from the water bowl and gave her a nod of understanding. I don't have a landline, just my cell phone, so there's no way to get in. Contact with me if you need anything. I'll try to get home as soon as I can. She walked over to the door. With her hand on the cool steel doorknob, she glanced over her shoulder. He had followed her out of the kitchen and was standing in the hallway, watching her. If for some reason you're not here when I get home, I'm going to assume you got tired of waiting around and had other pressing issues to attend to. Otherwise, I'll see you sometime after. Chapter 18. Lucian. Why do I get the feeling you're lying to me? Barrett growled through the phone. Maybe because you're already distracted and upset about having to host the Packmaster Summit. Lucian grimaced as he looked over at Jackson, who was busy checking out a female passing by with shorts so tiny her ass was hanging out. Jackson gave the curvy blonde a panty-dropping grin as she looked at him over her shoulder and giggled. Lucian reached out and slapped him on the back of the head. Hey! Jackson shot his friend a glare and straightened from leaning against the brick building on Main Street. It was the weekend, and in a college town like Jonesboro, people were out and about buying clothes, having drinks, and heading down to the local pub to catch some sports on TV. The drone of cars passing down the street had Lucian taking 2 steps into the nearest alley and away from the noise of the little town. How's that going, by the way? Lucian hoped he could get his Packmaster distracted by pack business and move his attention off the question of why Zane hadn't checked in. It's a fucking barrel of monkeys. I've got Jack Wellborn from Mississippi saying he needs more guardians, Charles Price from Tennessee saying they want fewer guardians, and Edward Boudier from Louisiana still giving me shit about his assassins. Barrett let out a low rumble, and Lucian knew his leader was not going to give the Louisiana leader any quarter for fucking up. The Louisiana assassins had shown up a few months earlier in Arkansas looking to kill Braxton, but when they'd failed to inform Barrett of their presence in the state, it had almost led to a territorial war between the two states. The Louisiana assassins were clearly in the wrong, but their Packmaster wasn't one to follow the rules unless it benefited him, so the hard feelings remained. And here I thought the Packmaster Summit was all caviar and mint juleps. Not likely. Barrett snorted. Enough with this runaround bullshit, Lucian. Where's Zane? Oh fuck. I'm not exactly sure. He did say something about following a lead on those meth heads we busted a few weeks ago. He said not to worry and that he'd contact me in a few days. That wasn't happening since he was holding Zane's dead phone with his free hand. Apparently Zane hadn't shifted back before taking off because all his clothes and his cell phone had been lying in the alley. Something was very wrong. You and Jackson stay in Jonesboro until he makes contact. I can't afford to lose any of my guardians, especially now. What do you mean? Lucian's gut tightened. There's more going on with Louisiana than what I'm being told. My instinct tells me that Edward Boudier is taking his vengeance to a whole other level because of the stink I raised with his assassins. That's not good. What's not fucking good is Zane not contacting me. You make sure to tell him. I'm going to have his ass when I find him. Sure thing, boss. Lucian killed the call and looked over at Jackson, who was now eyeing him with interest. What did he say? He heard from Zane. Jackson crossed his arms over his chest. Nope. And I got a feeling when he does, it's not going to be good for our pack brother. Chapter 19. Zane woke up buck-ass naked in the middle of Skylar's kitchen. The cool tile felt good against his overheated body, and he stayed still for a few minutes, reveling in the sensation. The shadow of the descending sun crawled across the floor, signaling the impending dusk. He frowned, raised himself up, and looked around for a clock. His gaze landed on the microwave. 6:30. He'd been asleep for almost 6 hours and he felt like he could sleep for 6 more. He'd never been like that. Usually 4 hours a night made him feel good and rested, but not now. Now he felt like he'd been run over by a fucking 18-wheeler and dragged for 100 miles. He forced his feet under him and stood on shaky legs. His thigh throbbed. He glanced down. The injury where he'd been stabbed had changed colors. What had been red was now dark crimson with a gray outline around the ragged edge of the cut. He ran his finger down the injury and flinched at the sensitive flesh. What the fuck? How had crystal meth done this to him? He was virtually immortal. It didn't make sense. He swiped his bundle of clothes off the counter and made his way through the apartment to the bathroom. The apartment was small, with a kitchen that led to the living room. There was a small island that allowed for eating but clearly no room to put in a table. The kitchen counters were clean with no knickknacks or decorations, and the living room only housed a small white couch and a coffee table. He glanced around the room. The few pictures that hung on the wall were all art posters. She didn't have one personal photo. It seemed impersonal, like a hotel. Usually women like to decorate their homes, putting their personal touches on the space. But Skylar hadn't done that. He couldn't help but wonder if her upbringing had anything to do with. He entered the bedroom and stopped in his tracks. Here in her boudoir she certainly didn't skimp. The enormous king-sized bed made of wrought iron and dark wood was flanked on either side with marble-topped nightstands. The bed was decorated in shades of white and cream, and it reminded him of silky ice cream on a hot Arkansas night. The only colorful things were a couple of frou-frou pink pillows on the bed. The nightstands were identical, with matching white lamps with tassels hanging off their shades. A few books and a candle decorated one of the nightstands, which he assumed was probably the side she slept on. Looked a bit lonely with just its lamp keeping it company. A matching dresser and chest of drawers rounded out the furniture in the room. Yet there were still no personal photos of any kind anywhere. What had happened to Skylar to make her seem so alone? Where was the little girl he once knew? What had happened in those few years he'd not kept in contact? And why had his Katie not contacted her? He cast a longing glance at the bed before turning to the bathroom. The last thing he needed was to get his unwashed ass in her pristine bed and stink it up. He shoved the cream and silver shower curtain back and turned the shower on full force. A shower had always perked him up before. Maybe it would do its magic this time. He stepped into the shower as the steam began to fog up the mirror like a New England morning. He stood under the spray of the hot water, braced his palms on the tile wall and bent his head, letting the water fall on his neck in a heated rush. He let out a groan as the heat loosened up the muscles between his shoulders, and the tension he'd carried all day fell to the drain with a cascade of water. He needed to find out what the hell was wrong with him before Barrett found out. He needed his job. No, he lived for his job. There was no fucking way he was going to let some meth-head werewolf destroy everything he'd created and worked for. Zane looked up and growled. He was going to hunt that fucker down and make him fix it. And then he was going to rip his. Chapter 20. So you're telling me Zane never came back, or made contact with you after he arrived? Lucien narrowed his gaze on Matt. The tattoo artist shifted his weight and looked a little uncomfortable as Lucien questioned him. Lucien always knew when a wolf was lying, and his gut told him Matt was telling the truth. Yeah man. I was too busy getting your guardian's tat going to even notice if he came inside or not. You know I do the guardian ink in the back room, away from the general public. Matt shook his head and laughed. The last thing I need is for humans to see that tattoo and demand to get the same thing. It is pretty badass, you know? Sure is. Jackson smiled his easy smile and popped a piece of gum in his mouth as he surveyed the latest addition to the tattoo shop in the form of a beautiful human female in jeans that hugged her curves. She gave him a sexy smirk as she bent over to pick up a piece of paper. She made sure to keep her ass up in the air so he could get a good look. Jackson growled his male appreciation. Lucien slugged him in the shoulder. Hey! Jackson scowled and rubbed his arm. Pay attention. You're not here to get laid. You're on duty. Lucien's measured words were emphasized as he spat them out between clenched teeth. Was bad enough that Zane was missing and he'd lied to Barrett about his whereabouts. I don't have time to babysit you or your dick. Fuck off. You'd like babysitting my dick too much for my comfort. Jackson snorted and returned the punch to the arm. Is there something I need to tell Barrett about? Matt arched his brow as he glanced around nervously. I mean, I don't want there to be any trouble. He's been a good packmaster and I don't want to piss him off. Fuck no. We got everything under control. As you know, your duty is to keep the guardians tatted up. That's it. Lucien scowled at the tattoo artist. Matt swallowed and let out a sigh. Yeah, the last thing I want to do is be on Barrett's bad side. You have no fucking idea. Lucien turned and made his exit out of the moon goddess tattoo shop. He hurried to his bike and straddled the massive motorcycle. Jackson mounted his bike and gave him a look. So what is it that we aren't telling Barrett? Jackson flipped the kickstand and balanced the bike between his powerful thighs. Lucien gave him a long look. That Zane has gone rogue. Chapter 21. Skylar, why does this canvas smell like wet dog? Hector grimaced as he positioned the tarpaulin on the floor for tomorrow's painting of the sheetrock. Her worker shook his head and said something in Spanish that was probably a lot of cursing. Did you adopt a homeless animal? She grinned. Maybe. If Hector only knew he was smelling a werewolf and not a dog. Okay, I'll be back tomorrow to get the second coat on. Hector stood up and ran his gaze along the wall, assessing the baseboards lined with blue painter's tape. Sounds good. She gathered her tools to take out to the shed. Hector grabbed the heavier tools and headed out the door. She shook her head. Hector, I can carry my own tools. I don't need your help. That's what you always say. You need to learn to accept help when it's given, Hector hollered from the yard. You're too damn stubborn for your own. Good. So I've been told. She snorted and cradled her tools as she followed after Hector. The sun had dipped behind the horizon, leaving purples and pinks in its wake across the sky. Despite the evening's approach, the humidity stuck to her skin like a plastic Halloween mask that had been worn by a sweaty child. Placing her tools inside the shed, she closed the door and placed the new chain and lock she'd picked up in town around the handle. She'd hidden the evidence of the break-in from her workers. She didn't want them asking any questions, and she didn't want them to worry that a meth head was breaking in and stealing the equipment. If they started worrying, then they'd start looking for another job site to work. Nice job today. I'll see you tomorrow bright and early. She grinned and strode toward the house. I can wait on you. Hector scowled. She stopped and turned to face the man. He'd been working with her since she started, and she'd learned that he was a dependable, hard-working family man. With 6 kids all under the age of 7. He worked long hours to give his family the life he never had. Hector, go home. I'm fine. You are going to miss Cecily's dance recital. Cecily was Hector's older daughter, and had been taking dance lessons for the last 6 months. She loved it more than life and told everyone she met that she was going to dance in New York City one day. A smile broke out across the man's face. She's wearing that pink fluffy thing you gave her. It's called a tutu, and I'm glad she liked it. Skylar had found the tutu in a yard sale in one of the upscale neighborhoods in Jonesboro. She knew Cecily would love it the second she'd laid eyes on it. Maria bought her a little crown thing to go with it. He pointed to the top of his head. Tiara. It's called a tiara. She shook her head. You've got 6 girls. Hector, you need to learn the language of all things female. Hector laughed a little. That's what you need, Skylar. A little girl all your own. You spoil ours too much. She felt her smile falter. She'd never have a child because she'd never have a mate. She was damaged goods. She knew her place in this world. She'd accepted her fate long ago. You've got enough girls for me to spoil. I don't need one of my own. She plastered on a fake smile that didn't have any roots in her heart and continued toward the house. I'll see you tomorrow, Skylar. Hector hurried to his truck. A few seconds later, there was nothing but a cloud of dust where his old truck had been. She went room to room, making sure no tools had been left behind. She didn't need even one to go missing. She was operating on bare bones. Darkness had fallen silently. She'd been too busy locking up to notice the time. Pulling out her phone, she frowned as she realized it was almost 8 o'clock. Unease slithered up the crook of her neck and pressed its weight onto her shoulders. She cut her eyes around the dark house, looking for any signs that someone had snuck in while she wasn't looking. No, that wasn't it. Whatever had her nerves on alert was coming from outside. Easing up to the living room window, she scanned the yard. Her pupils widened to accommodate the dark. Nothing. Stepping away from the window, she shook her head. I'm just being weirded out because of Zane. Ever since he'd shown up, she couldn't stop thinking about what kind of trouble he was in, and why he couldn't control his shift. If any werewolf found out that Zane was out of control, they wouldn't hesitate to turn him over to the Packmaster of Arkansas. It didn't matter if Zane carried the guardian mark or not. Easy money was easy money. And if the Packmaster found out she'd known about Zane and had hidden him, she'd face punishment as well. Maybe he'll be gone when I get home. The thought oddly disturbed her. Despite the danger he was placing her in, she didn't want him to leave. There were so many questions she had. When had he become a guardian? How were his parents? What was going on with his sister Katie? Unease slipped into a familiar feeling of sadness as she thought of his sister. Katie had been like her own sister until a few years ago. They'd grown up together and had lived together in Louisiana. Now they were strangers. Slamming the door shut and turning the lock, she hurried down the steps and across the yard to her own truck. Getting in, she started the engine and locked the doors. Old habits die hard. She turned on the road and headed back to town and to whatever surprise awaited her. Chapter 23. Still shaking from the force of her orgasm, Skylar pulled back enough to stare up into Zane's dangerous ice-blue eyes. She'd been around him for her growing up years and had never seen this passionate side of him before. He was always in control of his emotions, his expression, his future. Now after going down on her, he looked like he was ready for seconds. His generous mouth curved upward into a sensual smile that belied the dangerous teeth lying on the other side of his lips. He was a bit deceiving if you didn't know any better. To the casual observer, he looked like any other hot guy. To the werewolf population, he was a lethal guardian. You taste like sunshine. He growled low and deep, and it made her skin pebble with desire. Yeah, well, let's see how you taste, she volleyed back. His pupils dilated even further until all she could see was black. Running his hand up her back, he pulled her into his straining erection. With his free hand, he twisted a piece of her hair around his finger, lifted it to his nose and inhaled. He frowned as if remembering he couldn't scent her. She ran her fingertips across his furrowed brow. Which sense would you rather have? Smell or taste? A wicked grin stretched his lips. If it involves tasting you, definitely. Taste. Her heart thumped in her chest at his words, and her stomach warmed. She'd never wanted anyone like she wanted Zane. Yet the ghosts of her past were edging their way forward from the corners of her mind like wisps of steam. Not this again. I will not be a prisoner of what he did. I'm not that little girl anymore. Zane leaned down. His warm breath tickled her cheek and sent licks of delicious pleasure deep within her stomach. You're beautiful. She sucked in a breath to try to calm the vibrational arousal racing through every inch of her body. I've been called a lot of things, but beautiful is not one of them. She chortled nervously as she licked her dry lips. He leaned back, capturing her gaze with a hardened one. That can't be true. Her face heated and she shifted her weight. She should never have said anything. He probably thought she was an insecure woman looking for a compliment. She took a deep breath and grabbed his hand. I think we started a job that needs finishing. She tugged on his hand as she took a step toward her bedroom. Didn't feel like a job to me. He grinned, making her body heat with lust. She didn't think she'd ever needed a male as much as she needed him right now. Once they were inside her bedroom, he spun her around in his arms. You taste like heaven. He leaned down and covered her mouth with his tongue snaked between her parted lips and licked every inch of her mouth like she was dessert. When he finally pulled away, she couldn't breathe. You've certainly changed since I last saw you, Skylar. His gaze roamed down her body like a heated caress. Those ghosts that had hung back in the shadows of her mind lurched forward. She sucked in a deep breath at his words. Cold reality skittered across her flesh, and she pushed him away and wrapped her arms around herself like a shield. I had to grow up pretty fast, Zane. Not everyone was born with a silver spoon in their mouth like you. I didn't mean. He narrowed his eyes and reached for her, but she shook her head, not letting him finish. It doesn't matter. This was a mistake. We are a mistake. She took a step back from his warmth, determined to be strong. She didn't need this right now. Getting involved with a man, even just for one hot night, would complicate her plans for the future. She needed a clear head. And whenever she was around Zane, he made her head spin. Are you scared of me? He cocked his head and shot her a heated gaze. Of course not. I'm scared of letting you see me. Emotional scars aren't that sexy to a male like you, who could have the finest female in the state. Though the words were silent, they brought tears to her eyes. Her heart rate shot up as she grabbed her robe and escaped into the kitchen, putting much-needed distance between them. She'd gotten the apartment because it was safe and the price was right. At the time she hadn't cared that it wasn't that big. But with Zane standing in the middle of the room and taking Up space with his huge muscles and sexy vibe, it seemed the size of a shoebox. Securing her robe, she opened the refrigerator and pulled out 2 beers. She shoved one at him as she passed him on her way to her bedroom. What she needed was a shower. A very cold shower to wash his scent off her and clear her mind. He caught her arm before she made it into the bathroom and spun her around. She knew she needed to get away, but the warmth coming off his hard, naked body was too much of a temptation for her to step away. He was going to be her kryptonite. Skylar, talk to me. Zane, I don't. Knock, knock, knock. Zane tensed and Skylar cut her eyes up at him. Skylar, is everything okay in there? Mrs. Nelson called out from the other side of the door. Skylar rolled her eyes to the ceiling and let out a sigh. She mouthed "Be quiet" to him as he made his way into the bedroom and closed the door. Taking a deep breath, she strolled over to the door. Before reaching for the doorknob, she cut a glance over her shoulder to make sure Zane had stayed in the bedroom. The last thing she needed was for Mrs. Nelson to see she had a visitor. That old lady would want to know everything about Zane, from his blood type to his shoe size. Not to mention that if she suspected he was staying with her, that old bat wouldn't hesitate for 1 second to rat her out. To her landlord, the last thing she needed was another pair of eyes on her. Gripping the doorknob in her hand, she flung open the door. Mrs. Nelson, what can I do for you? She plastered a hard smile on her face and met the woman's beady gaze. She cocked her head around Skylar's shoulder, trying to get a look inside. I thought I heard noises. I know you don't have a TV, so that couldn't be it. She swung her gaze back to Skylar. It held an intensity she wasn't used to feeling from the frail lady. I had the radio on. That's probably what you heard. She forced herself to hold the woman's gaze. Didn't sound like a radio to me. Much too loud. Her eyes narrowed into snake-like slits. Oh well, it's my new sound system. It can get pretty loud. She gave her neighbor a sheepish grin. I'm so sorry to have bothered you with it. I'll make sure I keep it turned down. Skylar eased the door closed, but the woman put her foot in the way, preventing it from shutting. Are you okay, Skylar? You're acting a little strange. I'm just exhausted. Been busting my ass to get this job finished. Mrs. Nelson frowned her disapproval at the coarse language. Sorry. I meant but. Skylar blushed. Well, try to keep it down. You don't want to be known as the troublemaking neighbor, do you? Why, just look at how everyone avoids Samantha. In 243, after that whole debacle, good girls are quickly becoming a thing of the past. You don't want to get a bad reputation, do you? A low rumble came from behind her bedroom door. Skylar forced out a laugh. As you can hear, I think my plumbing is acting up again. Better go check on it. She slammed the door in the old woman's face. Leaning back against the door, she let out a sigh. Her bedroom door eased open and Zane stood there looking pretty pissed off. She held her fingers up to her lips and turned to take a look out the peephole. Mrs. Nelson closed her door behind her. Spinning around, she leveled a glare at him. I told you to be quiet, she hissed. And I don't like how that old hag talked to you. He curled his fingers into fists as anger shot from behind his eyes. I learned a long time ago to ignore people's opinions of me. She shrugged and headed into the kitchen. It's never okay for people to talk shit, Sky. Her heart tumbled in her chest at his endearment for her. It had been a long time since she'd heard him call her by that nickname. Whatever. Look, we have bigger issues at hand. She waved her hand up and down his body. You apparently have a problem with not being in control of your shift. And I am on an impossible deadline to get the house finished. She shoved past him into the bathroom. Before she shut the door, she looked at him. Which is another reason we can't happen. We don't fit into each other's world. We can't ever happen, Zane. Chapter 24. What the fuck just happened? Zane murmured. 1 second he was a breath away from sinking himself into heaven, and the next, she was cold as a snowdrift. No woman had ever turned him down. Ever. Stomping into the kitchen, he opened the fridge and pulled out another beer. He frowned as he surveyed her meager shelves, which contained only sandwich meat, leftover lasagna, a package of sliced cheese, eggs, bacon, and a 6-pack of beer. No wonder she was so thin. The girl needed to eat. He popped the top of the glass bottle and turned it up. He downed half the beer before he heard the shower turn on in the bathroom. His dick hardened further as he imagined Skylar stepping into the tub, the water glistening off her perfect, silky skin. She'd probably lean her head back and let the water cascade off her auburn hair and down her slender back. He imagined her arching into the stream as she ran her fingers through her hair. Lost in his vivid image of her, he leaned back against the kitchen counter and closed his eyes. She would be soaping up the washcloth and then caressing her breasts until they were soapy mounds. She'd run the cloth down across her flat stomach and make little circles before inching down farther until she touched her sensitive flesh between her long legs. His eyes popped open and he downed the beer. His body was on fire and on edge. And if he didn't do something, he was going to go crazy. Fuck it. He slammed the empty beer bottle down on the counter. Reaching for a stack of napkins, he grabbed a handful. Walking into the living room, he planted himself on the couch and leaned back. Taking his hard dick in his hand, he began to stroke, imagining it was her hand around him instead. If he wasn't going to have Skylar tonight, then he damn sure was going to have the fantasy of her instead. Chapter 25. You needed to see me, Barrett? Damon Trahan ambled into Barrett's office and gave his packmaster a nod in greeting. It had been well after midnight when he'd been summoned, and he wasn't feeling too friendly toward his boss. I did. Barrett shot him a scowl before turning his attention back to his computer screen. Look, I get I'm low man on the totem pole and all, but could you maybe next time wait until morning? You know how Ava hates it when I get pulled out of bed. Stop right there. Barrett's fingers froze on the keyboard and he held up a large hand. Not another word about what I interrupted between you two in bed. That is not an image I need in my head. Damon's lips tilted up ever so slightly. He liked that Barrett wasn't lusting after his woman. He knew the hard-ass packmaster saw Ava as a little sister. Good thing too. He would hate to have to kill his superior for looking at his mate's fine ass. Fine. No play-by-play. He leaned back in the chair facing Barrett. But you have to admit this is becoming a habit, you getting me out of bed at all hours of the night. You're a guardian. It's part of the job description, Barrett deadpanned as the computer screen drew his attention once again. Be honest, man. How many times have you called Jaden out at midnight for a meeting? Or Lucian? Hell, any of the other guardians for that matter. Jaden doesn't go to bed at sundown like you do, jackass. I don't go to bed early. Damon frowned and crossed his arms over his chest. Is that what that fucker said? Barrett cracked a smile. That's what Ava said. She told me she needed you home by 6. I'll have a talk with her. He loved his mate, but she sometimes pushed the line when it came to the packmaster. Speaking of Ava, how's her remodel coming? Good. I think she wanted it done faster so she can get it on the market while the housing market is hot. She doesn't want to move back to Jonesboro, which makes everything easier on me. Ava's house had been bombed by red wolves as payback after he'd rescued her from captivity. Forced to go on the run with her, he'd quickly realized he'd fallen in love. In the end, he couldn't let her go. After judgment was meted out against the kidnapper, Barrett had mated Damon and Ava together. She got someone good, I hope. Contractors will fuck you over if you're not careful, especially if they are dealing with a woman. They think they can pull one over on them. Barrett snorted. Actually, this contractor is female. No shit. Barrett nodded in appreciation. Yeah, she and Ava seemed to click. Plus, she came in under bid and promised to be on schedule. Just wait. I'm sure some unexpected expense will crop up and you'll get it up the ass. It's Ava's business. I try to stay out of it. I did tell her it was a bad idea to hire someone she'd never met in person. She's working with a contractor via Skype and phone. Barrett froze. He turned to give Damon his full attention. Well then, I think it's time for Ava to take a trip over to Jonesboro to check on the progress. I mean, it would only make sense to check in. I've tried to get Ava to go, but she doesn't want to be without me. Which is why you're going with her. Chapter 26. Fuck. Lucian glanced at his ringing phone and grimaced. Even if he answered it, he wouldn't be able to hear anything over the music in the club. The smoke alone was killing him. After making sure Jaden and Braxton had gotten their tats, Lucian had sent them on their way back to Little Rock. He and Jackson had stayed behind to try to find out what was what with Zane. What? Jackson craned his neck to see the caller ID. Dude, it's Barrett. You need to answer it. No shit. The ringing stopped and Lucien shoved the phone into his back pocket. They'd hoped they could find a lead on Zane at Jonesboro's only nightclub, but so far they'd come up empty. It was like he'd disappeared off the face of the earth. So what's the plan? Jackson glanced at him before turning his back on yet another human female who'd eased onto the bar stool next to him in the crowded club. The plan is to avoid Barrett, find Zane, and get to the bottom of what the hell is going on with him. You don't think he's using, do you? Concern creased Jackson's face. What? Meth. You don't think he's using meth? For fuck's sake. Zane we're talking about. He's the most in control guy. I know. He hardly ever drinks. Lucien slammed down the shot of tequila and motioned for the bartender to give him another. Yeah. Then what the hell is up with him? Jackson dragged his eyes away from a passing female with skinny jeans that hugged every curve. He met Lucien's gaze with a worried frown. I don't know, man. All I know is he's not been right since the drug takedown. Were you in the house after it was over? Did you see him do anything? Take anything? Jackson shook his head. I barely left his side for 2 seconds. Besides, they were still cooking the shit. The product wasn't even ready for distribution. He glanced around, making sure no one else was listening into their conversation. Hell, it was still liquid. Or it was until Zane bumped into it, and it destroyed what was left. It doesn't make sense. All I know is something is going on with Zane, and if we don't find out what it is before Barrett does, he's going to be out of the Guardians. Lucien sucked back the rest of the bitter beer. At best. What do you mean? Lucien narrowed his gaze. Getting kicked out is going to be the best outcome. I know Barrett, and he's a stickler for upholding the Lupin law. If Zane doesn't stop shifting in public, or if he's on drugs, he's going to be facing a tribunal. And we both know what that means. He's going to get taken out. Permanent. Chapter 27. Where the hell are you going? Zane thundered. Shoving down her anger, she maneuvered around Zane's large body and snatched her keys and backpack off the kitchen counter. I need to go check on something. She spun around and faced him, not ready for her body's reaction to seeing him standing there wearing nothing but a sheet wrapped around his lean waist, intensity sparking from his eyes. After their argument, she'd shown him some sheets and a blanket so he could sleep on the couch while she tossed and turned in her own bed. He didn't understand what she'd been through. Hell, most people wouldn't. But once he found out what she was, damaged, then he'd leave her alone soon enough. Aware of his status demanded a pure female, unblemished and perfect in every way. She didn't want to ruin him too. It's fucking 1 o'clock in the morning. You're not going anywhere this late. His eyes blazed as he stared her down. He probably meant to intimidate her and frighten her into submission. What he didn't realize was that it was turning her on instead. Stupid girly hormones. She shifted her weight, thankful his sense of smell was on the blink. Otherwise, he'd know how attracted she was to him right now. I have a business to run, and that involves checking on my work sites to make sure some meth head isn't stealing my shit. She stormed toward the door and turned. She waved her hand up and down his body. And you can't come because you're naked. The last thing I need is to be driving around Jonesboro with a naked man. Or wolf. It was definitely the last thing she needed. How could she concentrate with his male scent filling up her truck like an aphrodisiac? The last thing you need is to take on a thief by yourself. You could get hurt. Or worse. Her gaze drifted south to where his fingers clenched the sheet. She swallowed back the lust that was currently warming her stomach and threatening to take control of her senses. She shook her head. I've got a gun. I'm not running into danger like you think. I do have a brain, you know. Skylar, don't you think about opening that door? His growl sent a delicious shiver across her heated skin. A smirk played on her lips as she turned the doorknob and flung open the door. Don't wait up. She slammed the door behind her just as he let out a growl. Tightening her grip on her backpack, she hurried to her truck before he could follow. Chapter 28. Damn it. Zane started for the door just as his sheet fell to the floor. She'd done it. She'd actually disobeyed him and left. He glanced down at the erection he was sporting and shook his head. She disobeyed him and it made him hard. Again. How fucked in the head was that? His body surged to life as the urge to shift took over. His skin prickled and his gut clenched as rage fueled his body. He sucked in a deep breath to control his breathing and force his body to stop. The shift. His gaze landed on the door. Once he shifted, there was no way he was going to be able to open the door and go after Skylar. But if he left now, someone in the apartment complex might see him once he shifted into Wolf. Both fucking choices sucked. Fuck it. He opened the door and sprinted for the back of the complex. If he was going to shift, it was better to do it away from the security lights that surrounded the front of the building. He made it down the back steps and raced to the tree line just as he heard Skylar's nosy old neighbor call out her name. The old bat was probably up late doing some TV shopping for some cat figurines. Or some shit like that. His body trembled as the shift washed over him. He stayed in the shadows of the trees, hoping the old woman wouldn't walk out her door. If she saw him, she would probably call animal control or worse, the local news channel with reports of a bear. Finally the door shut and he relaxed. The old woman was smart enough not to come looking out into the dark. Good for her. Never knew what might be lurking in the shadows. Zane lifted his head at the star-speckled night sky. The balmy Arkansas air did nothing to cool his overheated body. No wonder so many wolves preferred the cooler climates like Colorado and Montana. He cut his eyes and surveyed his surroundings. Didn't matter that he couldn't sense Skylar to get a trace on her. And it didn't matter that he'd been covered with a tarp while being transferred here. He didn't need any of that to find his way back to the house that she was working on. When his sense of smell had failed him, his hearing had been amplified. He'd been doing more than just hiding under that tarp while being driven down Arkansas roads. He'd been listening to his surroundings and learning how to get back to where he'd been. His ears perked up as the shrill of a train whistle cut into the black of the night. His mind quickly retraced the direction toward Skylar's destination. He sprang off his feet and raced along the tree line out of sight of humans. His gut told him that something was off where Skylar was concerned. He didn't know what it was, but he damn well intended to find. Chapter 29. I want to go too. Granny propped her hands on her skinny hips, making her yellow and green muumuu crinkle up a bit, and frowned. Granny, this is not a vacation. It's just a quick trip to go check on the progress of Ava's house. Once they got that house fixed and on the market, he'd feel relieved. It had nothing to do with money. Hell, as a guardian he did pretty fucking well. All guardians did. He just didn't want Ava to have a house or a place she might run off to if she got pissed at him. Getting rid of the house would be just one more step in healing the feelings of abandonment from his past. I didn't say it was. I'm just bored. What about running your? He cringed as he forced the words out. Business. I need a little break from all that selling. Why, the only time people come up to me anymore is to find out what flavor edible underwear I have. Feel used. Granny pursed her lips into a thin white line. Damon felt nauseated. Besides, I need a little time away to refresh. And I want to check out what Jonesboro has to offer. Heard they have a cute little farmer's market on Saturday and a street festival every Thursday night. First of all, I'm not going to just hang out. I have things I need to get done. Besides, I'm taking my Harley and Ava's going too, so there's no room for you. We can put the sidecar on it and there will be room for me. Granny's weathered face brightened. Oh hell no. No one is putting that monstrosity on my Harley. Damon fought back a shiver. The Guardians were still giving Jaden hell about when he'd discovered the sidecar on his beloved Harley-Davidson Breakout, with Granny in the passenger's seat. Just wasn't a good look. What are you guys talking about? Ava walked into the living room pushing a rolling suitcase. Wait. Hold up. What's with the suitcase? You know there's no room for it in my saddlebags. Just take one set of clothes. He shifted his weight as the estrogen in the room doubled. I can't travel with just one change of clothes. What if the weather changes? Or it rains? Or I spill something? Or we find a nice restaurant? Not to mention my shoes. I need my shoes, Damon. Her eyes widened frantically. What are y'all discussing? Jaden strolled in with Haley snuggled under his arm. Jaden planted a kiss on her lips when she gazed up at him. Damon won't let me go to Jonesboro with him and Ava. Granny pouted and gave Jaden puppy eyes. Damon, stop being a dick and take Granny. Jaden glared at him. Jaden language. Granny quickly corrected. Why don't Granny and I take my SUV and you ride your Harley? Ava said. That way we can pack whatever Plus, I've been dying to check out this new Arkansas artist, Andy Allison. I've seen her artwork online and I want to buy some before she gets expensive. Good idea, dear. Get her on the way up. Granny smiled and patted her hand. I hope she's better than that artist who did that canvas for me in Little Rock. I asked for an abstract garden. I got a picture of a vagina. Damon's stomach clenched as he shook his head, trying to dislodge that mental image. Granny, please. Jaden rubbed his eyes. That's a good idea. You and Granny ride together and we'll meet up at the house. Damon knew better than to argue with either Granny or Ava. Besides, this way he could do a little investigation on his own without Ava knowing what he was up to. I'll pack a picnic. Granny clapped her hands together and grinned. It's only a 2-hour drive, Granny, and it's hot as hell out there. We're not doing a picnic. Damon looked to Jaden for support, but his fellow guardian just shrugged his massive shoulders. Dude, you're fighting a losing battle. Just go with it. Jaden smirked as he and Haley made their exit. Damon gritted his teeth. Fucking Jaden. Chapter 30. Zane's body pulsed with adrenaline as he raced across the rice fields toward the city. For a small town, it sure had a lot of nightlife going on. He'd encountered a couple of teenagers parking on a back road and had scared the shit out of the guy when he'd leapt out in front of the car. The guy had screamed and shoved his girlfriend in front of him, which had earned him a well-deserved slap in the face. Then he almost got hit by a truck when he jumped across the railroad tracks. The asshole must either have been drinking or doing drugs because he leaned out the window and shot him the bird. The guy didn't seem fazed that he'd just seen a large-ass wolf. Zane's paws hit the ground in a rapid staccato. His lungs ached as he sucked in breaths with each bounding step. His heart beat between his ears and his body echoed with the need to find Skylar. And when he found her, he had half a mind to take her over his knee and his body warmed at the thought, not of hurting her but the idea of having her bent over her kitchen counter, or better yet the bathroom sink as he sunk his dick into her tight little body. He shook his head and continued his breakneck journey in the direction he knew she would be headed. She was too damn stubborn to listen to anything he said. Coming out here this late at night was a bad idea, even if she was carrying a gun. The full moon illuminated the white farmhouse sitting up in the distance. Relief poured off him in waves as he noticed her truck turning into the driveway and coming to a stop. She kept the headlights on as she got out of the truck. He gave her credit for that move. He kept his gaze locked on her as he hurried through the rice field. Unease pricked the back of his neck, alerting him to some unseen danger. A rustle came from the back of the house, followed by a large dark shadow. Whoever or whatever it was quick. Skylar, sensing the danger, lifted her gun in the direction of the noise. Zane's heart squeezed in his chest. He pushed his body harder, running as fast as his legs could carry him. Ignoring the sting in his lungs, he growled as he rushed to close the distance between him and the danger that threatened. Skylar. The shadow ran straight for Skylar and tackled her to the ground. The sharp echo of a gunshot pierced the quiet darkness. Zane's gut twisted as his blood ran cold. Please let Skylar be okay. Please let her be okay. He broke free of the rice field and ran into the yard. As he got close, he realized the shadow must be some kind of werewolf due to its size. Zane leapt through the air and knocked the assailant off Skylar. They tumbled to the ground in a tangle of limbs. He twisted his body and pinned the attacker to the ground. The guy was definitely wolf due to his size and the way his eyes were changing colors from blue to yellow, signaling an impending shift. The werewolf drew back his arm and slammed his fist across Zane's face, catching his nose in a stinging blow and knocking him off. Rage propelled Zane forward, and he launched his body as the guy began his shift into wolf. He didn't have but a moment with the upper hand. Once the guy shifted, they would be evenly matched. He lunged and caught the guy around the throat. A strangled gurgle slid out from his lips as Zane bit down harder. The guy dropped to the ground. Bloodlust seeped through his entire body as the assailant's blood trickled into his mouth. He craved the coppery taste. He wanted more. A whimper from behind had him freezing. Letting go of his hold on the werewolf, he glanced around for Skylar. His gaze landed on her a few feet away. Sprawled on the ground and lying perfectly still, Skylar let out another soft whimper. He leapt off the attacker and hurried to her side. He lifted his paw to her face and then cringed. He needed his human form. He needed to help her. Why the fuck wasn't he shifting back? He searched her face, frantic for signs of any injuries. Had she been shot? Was she hurt? And how the hell was he going to be able to help her in his wolf form? He glanced back at the werewolf, who was making his escape down the road on foot. He'd managed to shift back into human form before taking off, which pissed Zane off even more. He turned his attention back to Skylar and lowered his nose to her face. He let out a soft growl, hoping she'd wake up and talk to him. His nose brushed something wet at her temple. His breath caught in his throat. As fear seized his body, he licked the wetness. Blood. She'd been shot, and there was no fucking way he could help her in his current form. He lay down by her still body and rested his head on her chest. The slow rise and fall of her breathing gave him some consolation, as did the steady beat of her heart. For the first time in his life he felt fucking useless. He sat back on his haunches, lifted his head, and let out his frustration as he howled at the Chapter 31. Skylar blinked back the cobwebs and opened her eyes. The starry night sky stared back at her. She frowned for a second, wondering how the hell she'd ended up sprawled on the ground. Then she remembered the attacker. She tried to sit up, but a heavy weight on her chest pinned her down. She glanced down and smiled. She'd know that wolf anywhere. Zane lifted his furry face off her chest and gazed into her eyes. He leaned forward and gave her a lick across the face. Enough. You can get off me now. She eased up onto her elbows as he lifted his head. She winced at the sharp pain in the side of her temple. Reaching up, her fingers brushed something wet. She held her hand out and frowned at her blood-stained fingers. I don't remember hitting my head. That's because you didn't. He shot you. The bullet grazed the side of your head. You're lucky to be alive. Zane's deep voice echoed in the darkness. She looked over in his direction. He stayed beside her, crouched like a predator, his naked body gleaming under the bright moonlight. She'd been too focused on her injury to realize he'd shifted into his human form. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Shot? Her body began to shake uncontrollably. Holy shit. It was all she could force past her lips. I didn't realize he had a gun. I thought he was some unarmed crackhead trying to steal my equipment again. She pushed to her feet. Her legs buckled and Zane was suddenly right there, his strong hands around her waist, holding her up, lending her his strength. Easy. Are you all right? Maybe you have a concussion from the fall. His eyes bored into hers with worry. He probed the side of her head with tender fingers, as all the breath left her lungs in a whoosh. I'm fine. I'm just shaken, that's all. She sucked in a deep breath to steady her runaway heart. Skylar, what were you thinking? He tightened his hold on her waist and glared at her. Even without the blinding headlights from her truck, she still would have been able to tell how pissed off he was by his harsh tone. I was thinking I needed to protect my business, she fired back. Her mood shifted, replacing fear with irritation. It was a stupid move coming out here by yourself this late at night, he growled. Anger flared in her veins. She'd been bullied by men throughout her life, and she was fucking sick and tired of it. She shoved her hands against his steely chest, but he didn't budge. You have no idea what it's like trying to run your own business. You wouldn't understand what it's like to never seem to get ahead. She stuck her finger in the middle of his chest. Everything you ever had was given to you. Your family, your future, your position in life. Not everyone gets that. Not everyone is born into a family who cares about them. Some of us are born into a shitty family. Some of us were not meant to survive but end up doing that very thing anyway. Through our hell we find a purpose and try to find some redemption. She'd never been so damn mad in her life. Not when her father would forget to feed her when she was 5 years old. Not when her father would beat the hell out of her when she was 8, for not cooking his dinner to his liking. Not even when her father let his druggy friends fondle her in exchange for some dope when she hit puberty. So don't stand there and fucking tell me what to do. You don't have that. Right. Are we clear? She hissed out the last words as her hand itched to slap his perfectly handsome face. His eyes widened and then narrowed before he pulled her hard into his chest. Her body was pressed flush against his, and she could feel her nipples hardening against his chest. She hated the hold he had on her body and her emotions, and when she should have been afraid of his alpha male routine, she was anything but. Her body warmed under the pressure of his, and she didn't fight the urge to arch against his body like a cat. Zane Steele was going to be the death of her. That much. Chapter 33. I got breakfast. Damon frowned as he was awakened from a deep sleep and reached for Ava across the hotel bed, but all he got was air. He sat up and glanced around the hotel room. No sign of her anywhere. So who was talking? Open up. I've got coffee and donuts and everything, Granny's voice called out from the other side of the hotel door. Fuck me. Damon growled and whipped the sheet off his bare body. He snagged his jeans off the floor and smiled as he remembered Ava getting down on her knees last night to help him get undressed. She'd stayed there until he'd almost exploded before taking her on the floor. Buttoning his jeans, he lumbered to the door and peered out the peephole. Granny had her eye up to the tiny opening as if she could see inside. Shaking his head, he opened the door. I've got breakfast, the older woman said brightly. She pushed her way into the room and set the tray of coffee and bag of donuts on the dresser. What time is it? And where's Ava? He glanced out the door into the hallway, but it was empty. She's downstairs using the hotel computer. Said she was emailing her contractor today. Granny glanced around the room. Her gaze landed on Ava's thong hanging on a nearby lampshade. She arched her brow. Damon snagged a glazed donut out of the brown paper bag and shoved half of it in his mouth. He was an adult, but Granny had a way of making him feel like a naughty teenager. Go ahead and eat all those. Granny waved her hand at the bag. Ava already took 2 and a cup of coffee with her. She grabbed the second styrofoam cup and popped the lid off, pulling out some pink packets of sugar substitute and tiny cups of creamer. She doctored her coffee to her liking before tasting the brew. She eased into the chair by the window and took a sip. Are you ready for Ava to have her house finished? She stared up at him with expectant eyes. More than ready. He finished off his second donut and fished his hand in the bag for another. You know, that girl ain't going nowhere. Her eyes danced with mischief. I didn't say she was. Damon forced the bit of donut down his throat and shifted his weight. He might be mated to the love of his life, but his past and being abandoned rose up in his mind. She's the best thing that ever happened to me. He sat the coffee down and walked over to the window. Don't give her all the credit, son. Granny stood and patted him on the back. She's lucky to have you, Damon. I hope you know that. You should know that. You are the best thing that happened to her, too. She made her way over to the door. Granny. Damon turned to face the woman who'd raised him for the better part of his life. They might not be blood related, but their bond went much deeper, and she was very much his family. Yes. I think I'm lucky for all the women in my life. He gave her a respectful nod. Her weathered face broke out into a wide grin. I think you're right. She nodded toward the panty-clad lampshade. You know, if you ordered some of my edible underwear, there would be no evidence of Ava's drawers hanging all over the place. Chapter 34. A headache, clothes reeking of cigarette smoke, and some ugly chicks. Underwear. That's all I got to show for our little investigative trip to the club last night. Lucien scowled as he lifted his leather-clad arm to his nose and sniffed. God, I hate cigarette smoke. I get the headache and the smoke, but how the fuck did you get some chicks underwear? Jackson smirked, then took a sip of his coffee and leaned back in the chair in the back room of the Moon Goddess tattoo shop. She pulled them off at the bar and stuffed them in the back pocket of my jeans. Lucien's eyes widened in horror. Dude, she even wrote her number on the crotch. So, girls are getting creative with their calling cards. Jackson nodded his head in appreciation, scrawling my number on the band and giving them to the next girl I want to hook up with. You don't even wear underwear, dumbass. Lucien shook his head and pulled a pencil off the counter. He used the pencil to pick the thong off the floor and fling it into the nearby wastebasket. He'd been digging in his back pocket for his phone and had pulled out the panties instead. The second he'd realized what he was holding, he had tossed them to the floor like a hot potato. You're not that squeamish about thongs. Jackson snorted. You didn't see the girl wearing these. Plus, she smoked. He cocked his head at his partner. Even you wouldn't have tried to hit that. And you try to tap Everything. I resent that statement. Jackson took a sip and shook his head. I can't help it if the ladies love me. You just wait, asshole. There's going to be one girl who comes along who'll break your heart. You'll be as whipped as Damon, Braxton, and Jaden. Don't say that. You'll jinx me or something. Jackson sat up straight and his eyes widened. Lucien shook his head as his cell phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and gritted his teeth. Fuck, it's Barrett. Dude, you've got to talk to him sometime. You can't keep holding him off. Jackson warned. Lucien hit the answer button and held the piece of plastic to his ear. What's up, boss? Lucien steeled himself for Barrett's barrage of questions. Nice to see you haven't lost your phone. Seems like a lot of my werewolves are in the habit of losing their phones and can't seem to get in contact with me. Barrett's low voice growled across the line. Boss, I don't know where Zane is. I'm sure he must be deep undercover if he's not calling you back. Lucien looked down at the counter where Zane's phone sat. He'd talked Matt into parking Zane's Harley in the locked parking lot. He knew Zane would come back for his Harley, and he wanted it available for him. When he did never get between a whir and his Harley. What's your location? Barrett thundered. The Moon Goddess. I find it ironic that you just so happened to be at the last place Zane was actually seen before he apparently up and disappeared without letting his pack master know where he was going. Lucien flinched. I'm sure whatever is going on with Zane is temporary. Temporary. Sounds like a perfect word to describe his future status as a guardian. The call ended before Lucien could say another word. How bad was it? Jackson looked as if he was bracing himself for bad news. Let's just say if we don't find Zane and find him quick, then he's no longer going to be part of the Guardian team. Chapter 36. Her heart squeezed in her chest at his words. Zane had never woken up next to a woman before. She'd known he wasn't a virgin, not by a long shot. By the way he knew how to move his body and the miraculous things he could do with his tongue, she knew he was no novice. I'm stunned. Not the reaction I was hoping for. I'd rather have you breathless and screaming my name. He grinned as he dipped his head and sucked a nipple into his hot mouth. Her breath caught in her throat as her body warmed with desire. She rubbed her legs together to quell the ache he'd awakened. I didn't scream your name last night? She struggled to concentrate on her words as lust swept through her body. Actually, you did many times. He moved his attention to her other breast. She turned over to face him. She wanted to look into his eyes as he slid inside her body. She needed this connection. She'd never had that before. Someone kind and gentle yet able to control her body and give her what she needed when even she didn't know what that was. She pressed her palm to his chest and froze as she met his gaze. What's wrong? He frowned down at her, his eyes glowing yellow. How do you feel? She whispered. The other time she'd been this close to a or when he'd shifted, it had been horrifying. Horny. How do you feel? He cocked his head. Zane, your eyes. The words slipped out as she tensed. His eyes widened in horror. He shoved himself away from her and jumped off the bed, putting distance between them. He glanced at the mirror and then clenched his hands. Forgetting her nakedness, she rose up to her knees and reached for him. Zane. His gaze swept across her body, and his nostrils flared. His muscles tensed as he seemed to struggle not to touch her. She grabbed the sheet, tugged it around her body and stood. With her heart pounding in her chest, she took a step forward. Don't touch me. I don't have any controls, Skylar. I don't want to hurt you. He stepped away and squeezed his eyes shut. Even as a werewolf, I doubt you would hurt me. She spoke softly. Are you fucking serious? He shot her a heated glare. Skylar, I have no control over my body anymore, and if I don't find a way to cure it, I'm as good as gone. What do you mean? She frowned. Was he sicker than he was letting on? What do you think is going to happen when I shift in front of humans? That crime is punishable by death. Yeah, but you are a high-ranked guardian. They won't punish you for something you can't control. Yeah? How am I going to prove that I can't control it? Is there some kind of werewolf test you can buy at the fucking drugstore where you can pee on a stick? He growled. Irritation flared in her gut, and she fought to keep her temper under control. I get that you are frustrated about your condition, but you have no right to talk to me like I'm an idiot. Then get your head out of your ass and understand what's going on. He slammed his fist on her dresser. The wood cracked and splintered. You need to back that shit up right now, Zane Steele. You may be a male, but I'm not going to stand here and take your shit. Are we clear? Her body trembled under her anger, and she wanted nothing better than to knock him on his ass. And it was looking like she was going to get her chance.